Many intelligent, thoughtful, and well-educated people have come to believe two things about the Bible. First, that it has been mistranslated over time, and second, that religion itself was created as a tool to control the masses. What's important to say right up front is this. These beliefs didn't come from ignorance or stupidity. They came from absence, the absence of access to primary sources, the absence of exposure to how ancient texts are actually preserved, and the absence of a serious academic conversation outside of churches or internet debates. Most people have never been shown the manuscripts. They've never been shown how translation works. They've never been shown how historians, linguists, and archaeologists evaluate ancient documents, biblical or otherwise. So instead, they inherit conclusions without ever seeing the evidence. This video isn't a sermon. It's not an appeal to authority, and it's not about telling anyone what to believe. It's about slowing down, opening the primary data, and asking a much more honest question. If the Bible really was mistranslated and engineered for control, what would the evidence actually look like? And just as importantly, does the evidence support that claim? That's what we're going to examine. Has the Bible been mistranslated? And was religion created to control the masses? A large number of intelligent, educated people today believe that the Bible has been mistranslated over time and that religion itself was constructed as a mechanism for social control. These views are common in universities, online discourse, and popular media, and they are often held with confidence rather than hostility. Importantly, they are not the result of intellectual laziness or ignorance. They are the result of distance from primary sources, how ancient texts are preserved, and from how historical claims are actually evaluated. Most people never encounter the Bible as a historical artifact. They encounter it as a modern English book, already filtered through cultural conflicts, political abuses, and internet caricatures. As a result, assumptions about mistranslation and control often precede any engagement with the underlying evidence. The conclusions arrive first, the data is never examined. The mistranslation claim. The claim that the Bible has been mistranslated is rarely specific. It usually implies that the original text was altered to change its meaning, promote obedience, or conceal inconvenient truths. However, this assumption misunderstands how translation works and how ancient texts are preserved. Translation is not a game of telephone. The biblical texts were not passed orally for centuries before being written down. The Hebrew scriptures were written in Hebrew and Aramaic. The New Testament was written in Greek. Thousands of manuscripts, many predating Christianity's rise to political power, still exists. These manuscripts allow scholars to compare copies across time and geography. When differences appear, they are cataloged, studied, and publicly available. This is called textual criticism, and it is one of the most transparent disciplines in historical scholarship. The overwhelming majority of textual variants are minor, spelling differences, word order, or stylistic changes that do not alter meaning. No core doctrine of Christianity depends on a disputed passage. This does not require faith to acknowledge. It is simply how manuscript comparison works. In fact, the Bible is among the most well-attested ancient texts in existence. By comparison, many classical works accepted without controversy, such as those of Tacitus, Plutarch, or Caesar, survive in far fewer copies and with far larger gaps between original composition and surviving manuscripts. The question is not whether translation exists, it always does, but whether translation has fundamentally corrupted the text. The evidence does not support that claim. The control narrative. The idea that religion was created to control the masses is understandable, especially given history. Religious institutions have undeniably been used to justify power, suppress dissent, and enforce social hierarchies, but misuse does not equal origin. The earliest biblical texts do not read like tools of centralized control. The Hebrew scriptures frequently criticize kings, priests, and ruling elites. Prophets are depicted as confronting power, not serving it. The Exodus narrative is not about obedience to empire, it is about liberation from one. The New Testament is even more difficult to frame as a control mechanism. Early Christianity emerged among persecuted minorities with no political authority. Its central figure is executed by the state. Its earliest followers are imprisoned, beaten, and killed, not empowered. There is no incentive structure here for mass control. In fact, many of the teachings attributed to Jesus directly undermine systems of dominance, love of enemies, rejection of coercive power, elevation of the poor, and moral accountability for leaders. These are not the foundations of an efficient authoritarian ideology. That religion was later institutionalized and weaponized does not mean it was invented for that purpose. Power tends to appropriate whatever people already believe, whether religious, philosophical, or political. Why these beliefs persist? If the evidence is accessible, why do these assumptions remain so common? One reason is that most people are never exposed to the primary materials. They hear about the Bible, but never see the manuscript tradition, never learn how translation committees work, and never encounter how scholars debate and document uncertainty. Another reason is cultural inheritance. Many people grew up around shallow or coercive expressions of religion and understandably associate the text with the behavior of its worst representatives. The rejection is often emotional before it is intellectual. Finally, the internet rewards certainty, not nuance. Claims like the Bible was mistranslated or religion controls people are easy to state and difficult to unpack in a common thread. Serious examination requires patience, context, and humility, qualities rarely incentivized online. A more honest question. The question is not whether religious institutions have abused power. They have. The question is whether the Bible itself, its textual history, content, and origins support the claim that it was fabricated or corrupted for control. That question deserves evidence, not slogans. Engaging with the Bible critically does not require belief. It requires the same standards applied to any ancient text: manuscript comparison, historical context, linguistic analysis, and intellectual honesty. When those tools are applied, the simplistic narratives of mistranslation and mass manipulation begin to collapse. The Bible may still be rejected on philosophical or theological grounds, but it should not be dismissed on claims that do not withstand scrutiny. That distinction matters, not for religion, but for truth. Rebuttal. The Bible was not mistranslated, nor was religion invented to control the masses. The claim that the Bible has been mistranslated and that religion was created as a mechanism of mass control is a modern narrative that sounds intuitive, but collapses under historical and textual scrutiny. While the misuse of religion for power is well documented, the assumption that this misuse reflects the Bible's origin or textual integrity is not supported by the evidence. 1. The mistranslation claim is vague and unsupported. Claims of mistranslation almost never identify what was mistranslated, where, or by whom. This is not a trivial omission. In any serious historical or linguistic field, a corruption claim must point to a specific textual divergence, an earlier source, and a demonstrable change in meaning. The biblical manuscript tradition is unusually transparent. The Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament exist in thousands of manuscripts spanning wide geography and centuries. These manuscripts are not hidden or controlled by religious institutions. They are housed in museums, universities, and public archives. Textual variants are known, cataloged, and openly discussed. The vast majority are orthographic or stylistic. None alter core theological claims, moral teachings, or historical narratives. If a coordinated mistranslation had occurred, it would require global manuscript synchronization across communities that were often hostile to one another, a logistical impossibility in the ancient world. Translation committees today publish their methodologies, note textual uncertainties in footnotes, and regularly revise editions as scholarship advances. This is the opposite of covert manipulation. The idea of systematic mistranslation persists not because of evidence, but because of unfamiliarity with how textual transmission actually works. 2. Control is inconsistent with the text's earliest historical context. The notion that religion was invented to control the masses assumes centralized authority, political leverage, and enforcement power at the time of its formation. None of these existed for early biblical religion. The Hebrew scripture routinely challenges kings, condemn corruption, and portray political authority as accountable to moral law. Prophets are not agents of the state, they are adversaries of it. A text designed for mass control would reinforce hierarchy, not undermine it. Early Christianity is even more incompatible with this theory. It emerged among marginalized groups, spread without military power, and faced sustained persecution from both Jewish and Roman authorities. Its founder was executed by the state. Its followers gained no wealth, no protection, and no political leverage for centuries. Movements engineered for control do not begin by getting their leaders killed and their adherents imprisoned. 3. Abuse of religion does not prove its origin. History shows that religion has been used to justify power, violence, and coercion. So have philosophy, nationalism, science, and political ideology. Misuse does not imply design. Power structures co-opt belief systems that already command moral authority. The fact that later institutions weaponize religion says more about power than about the text itself. To argue otherwise is to confuse exploitation with invention. If control were the Bible's purpose, its content is remarkably inefficient. It emphasizes conscience, internal moral responsibility, love of enemies, and accountability before a higher moral law, all of which complicate authoritarian control rather than enable it. 4. The claim persists because evidence is rarely examined. The belief that the Bible was mistranslated and engineered for control often arises in environments where primary sources are absent. Most people have never examined manuscript traditions, translation notes, or historical context. Instead, they encounter the Bible through cultural conflict, political misuse, or secondhand critique. The narrative persists not because it is well supported, but because it is rarely challenged at the level of evidence. It functions as a conclusion in search of justification rather than a conclusion derived from data. 5. A better standard of criticism. The Bible may be rejected for philosophical, moral, or theological reasons. Those are legitimate debates. But claims of mistranslation and mass manipulation are historical claims, and historical claims must be evaluated using the evidence. When the same standards applied to other ancient texts are applied to the Bible, the popular narrative fails. What remains is not blind faith, but a historically robust document whose preservation and transmission are unusually well understood. Rejecting belief is a personal decision. Rejecting evidence is not a scholarly one. Reassessing claims of biblical mistranslation and social control, a textual and historical evaluation. Abstract. A common modern assertion holds that the Bible has been mistranslated over time and that religion, particularly biblical religion, was deliberately created to control the masses. These claims are widespread among educated audiences who lack formal exposure to textual criticism, ancient history, or manuscript studies. This paper critically evaluates these assertions using established methodologies from philology, historiography, and comparative textual analysis. It argues that claims of systematic mistranslation lack evidentiary specificity and that the control narrative is historically incompatible with the sociopolitical contexts in which biblical texts originated. While acknowledging historical abuses of religion by later institutions, this paper concludes that neither the textual transmission nor the content of the biblical corpus supports the hypothesis of intentional mass manipulation. Introduction. The belief that the Bible has been mistranslated and that religion was created to control populations has become a dominant cultural narrative in modern secular discourse. This view is often presented as self-evident, requiring little defense, and is frequently invoked without reference to primary sources or scholarly consensus. Importantly, this position is not typically held by individuals lacking intelligence or education. Rather, it is commonly held by those who have never encountered the Bible as an ancient textual corpus, subject to the same critical methodologies applied to other historical documents. As a result, conclusions are often formed in advance of evidence. This paper examines two central claims. One, that the Bible has been mistranslated in a way that significantly alters its original meaning, and two, that religion, as expressed in biblical texts, was engineered to control the masses. Each claim is evaluated independently using established academic tools. The nature of textual transmission and the mistranslation claim. Defining mistranslation. The term mistranslation implies that a text's meaning has been substantially altered, either accidentally or intentionally, through the translation process. In historical scholarship, such a claim requires identification of an earlier source text, demonstration of divergence in later copies or translations, evidence that the divergence materially alters meaning. Most popular claims of biblical mistranslation fail to meet these criteria. Manuscript evidence. The biblical corpus is preserved in an unusually large and geographically diverse manuscript tradition. The Hebrew Bible is attested through sources such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Masoretic text, and the Septuagint. The New Testament is preserved in thousands of Greek manuscripts alongside early translations into Latin, Syriac, and Coptic. These manuscripts span centuries and regions, often originating from communities with no centralized authority and at times with doctrinal disagreements. This diversity makes coordinated textual manipulation implausible. Textual criticism, the discipline that compares manuscript variants, is one of the most transparent fields in historical research. Variants are cataloged, published, and debated openly. The overwhelming majority of variants are minor, spelling differences, word order, or stylistic changes. No core theological or ethical claim depends on a disputed text. Translation methodology. Modern Bible translations are produced by committees of linguists and historians who work from critical editions of the original languages. Translation decisions are documented and uncertainties are frequently noted in footnotes. Competing translations exist precisely because the underlying data is accessible. This process is inconsistent with claims of covert or systematic translation. A text designed for manipulation would not survive under such scrutiny. Historical context and the control hypothesis. Requirements for social control. For a belief system to be engineered for mass control, it must originate within a context of political authority, enforcement mechanisms, and centralized power. These conditions did not exist during the formative periods of biblical literature. The Hebrew Scriptures. The Hebrew Bible consistently portrays tension between moral authority and political power. Kings are criticized, priests are condemned for corruption, and prophets function as opponents, not agents of the state. The legal and narrative structures emphasize accountability rather than blind obedience. The Exodus narrative, a foundational text, depicts liberation from imperial control, not submission to it. This is an improbable origin story for an ideology designed to normalize domination. Early Christianity. The early Christian movement emerged among marginalized populations within the Roman Empire. It lacked political power, military support, or institutional backing. Its founder was executed by the state, and its earliest adherents faced imprisonment, economic exclusion, and death. Movements constructed for control do not arise under conditions where adherence leads to persecution rather than advantage. The historical incentives are inverted. Institutional abuse versus textual origin. It is historically undeniable that religious institutions have been used to justify power, coercion, and violence. However, this phenomenon is not unique to religion. Political ideologies, philosophical systems, and even scientific frameworks have been similarly weaponized. Abuse of a system does not imply that the system was created for abuse. Institutions often appropriate pre-existing moral or symbolic frameworks to legitimize authority. The Bible's later use by powerful institutions does not establish its original purpose. Notably, many biblical themes, moral conscience, care for the marginalized, critique of wealth accumulation, and ethical constraints on rulers are counterproductive for authoritarian control. Why the narrative persists. The persistence of mistranslation and control narratives can be attributed to several factors. Lack of exposure to primary sources. Most individuals never encounter manuscript evidence or textual criticism. Cultural inheritance. Negative experience with religious institutions are often projected onto the text itself. Information asymmetry. Popular discourse rewards certainty and simplicity over methodological rigor. Category confusion. The Bible is treated as a modern ideological document rather than an ancient textual corpus. These factors create a self-reinforcing narrative that rarely undergoes serious evidentiary challenge. In conclusion, claims that the Bible has been mistranslated and that religion was created to control the masses are historical assertions that require historical evidence. When evaluated using standard academic methodologies, textual criticism, historical context analysis, and comparative manuscript study, these claims are not supported. This conclusion does not require belief in the Bible's theological claims, it requires only intellectual consistency. The Bible may be accepted or rejected on philosophical grounds, but it should not be dismissed on the basis of assertions that do not withstand scholarly scrutiny. This distinction matters, not for religion, but for the integrity of historical reasoning. The claim that the Bible has been mistranslated and that religion was created as a mechanism of mass control is often presented as a settled conclusion rather than a hypothesis requiring evidence. When examined using the same historical and textual standards applied to other ancient documents, this conclusion proves unsustainable. The manuscript tradition underlying the biblical texts is extensive, geographically dispersed, and methodologically transparent. Variants are well documented, publicly accessible, and overwhelmingly insignificant with respect to meaning. Claims of systematic translation fail not because scholars are unwilling to question the text, but because no evidence demonstrates the degree of corruption such claims require. Likewise, the historical contexts in which biblical literature emerged do not support the notion of intentional social engineering. The Hebrew Scriptures repeatedly challenged political authority, and early Christianity arose without power, institutional backing, or coercive capability. Movements designed for mass control do not originate under conditions of marginalization, persecution, and internal moral constraint. This analysis does not argue for the truth of biblical theology. It argues for intellectual consistency. Later institutional abuses of religion, however real, do not define the origin, transmission, or intent of the biblical texts themselves. To conflate misuse with invention is to commit a category error that obscures rather than clarifies historical understanding. The Bible may be accepted or rejected on philosophical or theological grounds, but the popular assertions of mistranslation and deliberate mass manipulation do not withstand scrutiny when evaluated against the available evidence. For those committed to critical inquiry, that distinction matters, not as an act of belief, but as an act of intellectual honesty.